right. Good evening, everybody. I think attendees are being let in. Give it a couple of minutes. We're really excited to have a really great panel tonight. Just give people a few minutes to trickle in. All right. All right. So we'll just give people a couple minutes, but in the meantime, we know that we're going to be recording this and sending it out via Twitter and other networks. So good evening. My name is Iman Bukadoum. I work for ACS this evening. I'm wearing my ACS hat, the American Constitution Society. I'm with the at-large chapter, and we're so honored to have an amazing and distinguished panel of females, fierce females, all females, this evening to discuss a difficult topic, but an important one that is really relevant about white supremacy and its impact on our communities across the country. And so I'll just start with quick introductions. Obviously, these are truncated because I'll be here all night explaining the extraordinary accomplishments of our panelists. First, I'll start with Ms. Asha Noor. Asha is a Somali racial justice and human rights advocate. She is a peace building and conflict resolution specialist, facilitator, and public speaker. Asha currently serves as the coordinating director for Communities United for Status and Protection, a national collaborative of grassroots immigrant-led organizations, one of the most important organizations out there doing very vital work on behalf of Black immigrants and other immigrants across the country, particularly in the TPS space. She is a senior trainer and long-term member of the Muslim Anti-Racial Collaborative, an amazing group. And on a national scale, Asha has worked on issues from policing to mass incarceration, surveillance, immigration, and criminalization of Black people and Black Muslims in particular. She holds a master's in conflict resolution from George Mason University, which is not too far from where I live, and has a bachelor's in political science from Michigan State University. Thank you so much for joining us, Asha. Second, I'd like to introduce our distinguished colleague from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Miss Marita. We're very honored to have you. She is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and advocates for civil rights on behalf of Asian American communities in the civil rights space, including in the immigrant rights space and the hate crime space, and manages varied projects, including anti-hate efforts, supporting naturalization services in DC, and also works with various communities on really is at the front lines of combating hate against Asian Americans, particularly in this historic moment. Marita holds a law degree and bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan. So go blue. No offense to Becky. Becky Monroe is the director of the Fighting Hate and Bias program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She was previously the director of the Divided Community Project at the Lawyers Committee, and worked with local leaders in addressing long-standing systemic issues around racism and other forms of discrimination. Before that, Becky worked on the Stop Hate Project at the Lawyers Committee, And she also led a team of attorneys and organizers in developing innovative legal advocacy strategies to support people targeted for hate crimes and hate generally. Becky also worked at the Justice Department as the acting head for the CRS, which is the Community Relations Service under the Obama administration. They do very important work, really centering the voices of communities. And she also worked in the White House, the Domestic Policy Council, as senior policy advisor, and really centered the voices of impacted communities across the country, and really focusing on innovative ways to empower them. Before government, Becky worked as an employment rights attorney for Bet Tzdek Legal Services in California, where she represented undocumented immigrants and women trafficked for labor. Really important and hard work. And she is a graduate of Georgetown University and Yale Law School, where she also clerked for the Honorable Richard Paez of the Ninth Circuit. So we have a really amazing panel. So virtual round of applause for all of them, including for Avi. So I'll just start off by kicking it off by throwing the question to maybe Becky to give us a background and just give us the framework for the way in which white supremacy is manifesting itself today, and the ways in which it's similar and different, and how we can maybe combat it.
Thank you, Iman, and I'm really honored to be on this panel with you and with Marita and Asha. I just want to give a very brief sort of overview of some of the ways that we have been trying to confront white supremacy. But I think one of the central points is it is critical to listen to people who are directly working with people who are targeted for hate, and therefore I want to quickly move to my colleagues who are doing this work, to Marita and Asha. But to begin with, I think one of the things that we talk about here and that we've always talked about is that hate is not new. And I think that for this group here, I think that will seem self-evident, but I think it is critical because we are in this moment where we have a president of the United States who is actively inciting racist violence. And so I think people will often talk about the ways that is different, but it does a huge injustice to generations of people who have been fighting racism and fighting discrimination in this country. And it also minimizes the ways in which white supremacy is not only the acts of white supremacists today, it is in fact reflected in systems. And the systems that we are talking about changing today require that we reckon with this longstanding history. So I think, one of the things when we talk about white supremacy, I want to talk a little bit to Iman's point. Excuse me, sorry. Avinash, not now, buddy. Sorry, best laid plans. But my 5-year-old knows a lot more about fighting white supremacy now, which is good. I think that it's important that we think about the ways in which not only is this president inciting violence, but he is trying to lose our history. So if you look at, for example, over the last few weeks, and again, this is just the most recent. This is not something that is new to this president. But if you look at things like executive orders that are purporting to ban education about the reality of racism in this country, about the way that this country was in fact founded in slavery, you get a sense of sort of where white supremacy is today in terms of what this president fears, and he fears the truth, and he fears, and that we sort of as advocates must make sure that we are both reckoning with this truth and this history, but then also thinking about sort of what does that lead us to do and what actions does that lead us to take. So before I sort of talk a little bit about the ways that we see this manifested in systems, I wanted to also just sort of highlight other news. And today we just a few minutes ago, the Leadership Conference on behalf of over 30 different civil rights organizations just released letters to both the House Intelligence Committee as well as the House Homeland Security Committee, calling out a recent whistleblower report in which the whistleblower documented the fact that DHS leaders, political appointees, were telling their own leaders to minimize and in some cases to hide intelligence about the threat of white supremacists in this country. it's important for us again to recognize this, that we are not only dealing with an ongoing history and systems of white supremacy, we are dealing with I'm sorry. Okay. With a president of the United States whose political appointees are actively trying to hide it. And so part of what we did was we asked not only that there be an investigation in this, but to really think about sort of what this is doing to communities. Because this is not, one of the other things I think it's important to note, white supremacy and reckoning with our history is not a political issue. There is nothing political about about white supremacists, the threat that white supremacists pose to communities. So people will say, oh, he was just trying to politicize the intelligence reports. He was threatening people's lives. Hiding real threats threatens people's lives. So I think it's important for us to sort of acknowledge that and grapple with that directly. I also think we cannot talk about white supremacy today without thinking about what happened yesterday with the announcement that there were no charges brought directly against any officers in the killing of Breonna Taylor. So if we want to think about what systems look like, how do laws develop in a way that reflect white supremacy and devalue Black lives, I think we have to sort of acknowledge that and point to that as well. I also, when we think about news from last week, looking at the news that came out about the detention center in Georgia, at Irwin, when we're thinking about, again, this was the hysterectomies that was done without full consent from the women who were detained there. This is, yes, we absolutely will call for the accountability for the doctor, for medical personnel, for other people who permitted this to happen and who enabled this to happen. But we need to recognize this is also a systemic problem. This is not a question of sort of a few bad apples who need to be addressed. This is a question of a system that was created. And as many people, you're hearing many people talk about this and talking about this in the news yesterday, the system is functioning the way it was created to function. And so I think that is something we need to grapple with. I also think, before I turn it over, I just want to highlight a couple of things that we can do to address these issues. One thing is,
hello.
Excuse me. One thing is to talk about data. I know data sounds like we're talking about numbers and that doesn't actually get to the real pain that we are talking about. But when we're talking about dismantling systems, in order to dismantle those systems, we need data, we need numbers. I'm going to briefly talk about sort of within the context of hate crimes. I know something that Marita and I have worked on for many years is thinking about sort of how do we improve that data. The official data coming from the government for years has been underreported. The FBI reports that on estimate, based on reports from law enforcement, that it's about 7,000 hate crimes across the country. The same Department of Justice, just a different part, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, says actually, based on our survey methodology, it's closer to 250,000. So that is the same Department of Justice telling you that these numbers are so wildly underreported. And the reason that also matters is that if you are someone who is targeted for hate, and if you are in a community, excuse me, if you are someone who is targeted for hate violence, and your law enforcement agency is reporting 0 hate crimes, if you are the family of Khalid Jabara, a young man who was murdered by his neighbor in an act of anti-Arab American violence, and he was killed as a part of a hate crime, that it was actually charged as a hate crime, but then the numbers show that it is not reported as a hate crime in the federal data, then that matters and that shows who matters. And then I think the final piece I will just say, and one of the most important, is that we listen to people, to the communities that are targeted for hate, about what are the services, what are the resources that they need. And that is something that we have learned from this administration, but we should take it to the next administration. So that means sometimes communities are pushing not for more prosecution, but for more support. They are pushing for restorative practices. They are pushing for other kinds of practices that we need to sort of learn and listen to those voices. And I think as I turn it over to my colleagues, I think that's something that we are trying to sort of see in all humility, that we need to sort of look at those issues. And I think that's why something I think we will probably talk about later is that we need to use the tools that are existing, but also listen to communities. And that means these threats need to be treated as the civil rights issues that they are. And we want to avoid, again, going back to frameworks that have relied on white supremacist theories, including domestic terrorism frameworks. So
Thank you.
Avi and I will sign off for a moment, but we are both here and I appreciate everyone's patience.
No, thank you so much. That was really, really insightful and helpful to really set the framework, and a perfect segue for our friend, Miss Marita at Cubanes. Did I get that right? I hope I didn't butcher it. but yeah, we're really honored to have you join us because you are really leading the fight at the front lines on the ground on behalf of so many Asian American communities that are suffering because of the terrible rhetoric that this president and others have been putting forth in this historic moment. So take it away. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Iman. Appreciate it. I really appreciate Becky's remarks because we have been working together and she's framed this conversation really well. We know hate is pervasive in the United States. As Becky said, we know that racism, discrimination, this is nothing new, right? But what I'm here to talk to you about today is the recent spike in anti-Asian hate connected to the coronavirus. My organization, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, has been working to raise awareness about this increasing racism and discrimination against Chinese Americans, but also more broadly Asian Americans who have been wrongly blamed for the coronavirus and COVID-19. We know that this discrimination is taking many forms, from hostility and suspicion that Asian Americans are carriers of the virus to verbal abuse, harassment, and even physical violence. So I had actually prepared a handful of slides because I'll be referring to a number of resources and I hope that this will be helpful to you. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and hope that, are you seeing the slides or are you seeing a mess of my actual computer screen?
Yeah, we can see the slides. They look great.
Okay, excellent. So this graphic is an example of just one of the reports that has been submitted to our hate tracker, Stand Against Hatred, which I'll be talking more about later in the presentation. But as you see, I mean, people have even weaponized the term coronavirus in their attacks against Asians and Asian Americans. The vast majority of the reports that we have received to our organization include verbal harassment, but we've also seen this hate escalate into physical violence. Some of the incidents that you may have heard about in the news were the stabbing of an Asian American family when they were at the market in Texas because the perpetrator thought that they were Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. More recently, there have been reports of an elderly woman who was attacked and set on fire in New York City. I mean, these are serious things that are impacting our community. And so let me also go on to say that, in addition to the individual reports that we've been seeing, this spike in hate is also borne out through various surveys, right? So this graphic that you're seeing is from a survey, an Ipsos survey that was published by the Center of Public Integrity, that about a third of Americans have witnessed someone blaming Asian people for the coronavirus epidemic, and 60% of Asians have witnessed the same problem. This was also borne out by a more recent survey by Pew. So, I mean, we know this is a serious problem. And so I wanted to also, we have reports about these incidents submitted to our organization via this website that we set up back in 2017, Stand Against Hatred. We encourage people to report, obviously the more egregious incidents, but also hate incidents, right? Because it's all important, it's all impacting our community and it deserves to be talked about. So we encourage people to report to our site, which is available in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And if you go to the site, you can also see examples of some of the reports that people have shared with us. One moment. Okay. And another point that I wanted to make is we are not the only organization doing this work. Obviously, many organizations across the country are engaged in documenting, but also combating hate. And in particular, in the Asian American community, there are a number of organizations that are attempting to capture this information. And just to give you a sense of the scope of the problem, from the beginning of this spring, when the coronavirus epidemic hit the United States through the end of July, several of the groups that we work with have a combined tally of more than 2,800 individual reports of anti-Asian harassment and discrimination related to COVID-19. And of course, as we're talking about this, I have to talk about, Becky alluded to this before, these incidents are coming from, they're being fomented by a lot of the really harmful rhetoric that we are hearing from our elected officials, including the president, who continues to use the term Chinese virus and other derogatory terms, which we object to, and experts actually have said that this sort of terminology, identifying a disease or a virus with a certain geography, is not only stigmatizing, but obviously leads to more problems. So we are pushing back on this sort of harmful rhetoric. And actually just last week, I believe, the time sort of blurs right now, right? Just last week, the US House of Representatives passed a resolution that was led by Representative Grace Meng, condemning all forms of anti-Asian bigotry. So it's good that members of the House of Representatives voted for that and have taken a stand or on record objecting to this sort of hatred, but we need more of this, right? We need people to understand that these labels, this rhetoric causes stigma and leads to very real harm against our communities. And then, in addition to encouraging people to report, of course, we have to offer resources. So I am very pleased that we are partnering with the Lawyers Committee and their Stop Hate project. So this is the Stop Hate hotline, 1-844-9-NO-HATE, where people can call and get access to social services support and legal assistance. And our partners with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles are actually providing the language support to the hotline. So people who need assistance in some of the more commonly spoken Asian languages should call the hotline and they'll be able to access assistance also. And then finally, one of the things I wanted to talk about is, it sounds odd to say, but sort of a bright spot in all of this, right? Is that as we were seeking resources and talking to different partners about how we can deal with this spike in hate against our communities, we were approached by an organization called Hollaback, which is grounded in addressing street harassment. That's how they came about. So they have a training on bystander intervention that teaches their 5Ds methodology on how one can, rather than being a passive bystander when witnessing harassment and hate, can actually intervene. And so we have partnered with them to adapt their training to respond to this moment. So let me move to the next slide. If my slide deck will move, there we go. So since this spring, we have offered a slate of three different trainings with Hollaback, one on bystander intervention, one on conflict de-escalation, and a training specifically for the Asian American community on how to respond to anti-Asian harassment. These are free 1-hour trainings. We talk about the history, we talk about the spectrum of disrespect, we talk about resilience, and really give people practical tips on how they can intervene if they witness or experience harassment. Very pleased to say we have trained more than 15,000 people since we started this in the spring. And there on the slide, you see the website where you can find more information about these trainings and upcoming training dates. So we encourage you to sign up and take a look at that. So we'll be talking more, but let me just close out this part of my presentation to say that, we're all scared of the coronavirus. No one should also have to fear that they'll be subject to racist attacks because of it. As we convey in the trainings, the safety that we want for Asian American communities is what we should be working to create for all communities, including Black and Brown communities. It's unfortunate that it's necessary, but we are proud that we're able to offer these trainings with Hollaback because it gives us the opportunity to educate people about the Asian American community, share intervention strategies that can help people feel empowered to act so that we can take care of one another. So, if it wasn't clear before, the pandemic has really shown us that we all that we're in this together and we have to work together.
Thank you so much, Marita. That's so powerful. 15,000 people trained since the spring. That's extraordinary. Thank you so much for sharing that. And and for all your work at the front lines. It's so important and so inspiring, and so necessary. So thanks. So now I'll turn it over to Asha, who will provide another perspective from the front lines, discussing the impact of white supremacy on the communities that she works with, particularly African immigrant communities, and the way that white supremacy is manifesting there, particularly African communities and also immigrant communities. So she gives us a very interesting intersectional perspective as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman, and thank you to just a wonderful co-panelist as well, Marita and Becky. I have learned a lot just from this conversation and being in the process of preparing for this discussion. And, I kind of wanted to jump in from sort of the vantage point around the ways in which white supremacy and hate impact policies and systems. As Iman mentioned, a large part of the work I do is with Black immigrant communities and Black communities at large. And in my current role, I'm also working with Asian communities as well, in particular with one of the organizations we work with is Nepali speaking, based in New York, Adhikar, and also I'm working with Haitian Bridge Alliance and African communities together in Undocu Black Network. And we're currently in the process of our collaboration, which Iman spoke a bit about, which is called Communities United for Status and Protection. And so, some of the things that all of our organizations are experiencing is, the challenges that our members are going through in this moment. A large part of the work that we do is around temporary protected status, and DACA and DED, and on securing immigration and a pathway towards permanent residency and citizenship. And so, when we think about white supremacy and hate, we have to also, as my co-panelists mentioned, look at it from the ways in which it impacts policies and systems, and again, how it's not new. So, with current updates like the Ramos decision, for example, which puts, over 300,000 TPS holders at risk of losing status. And so that just happened last week. And although it feels like a lifetime ago, these are some of the things that are happening under Trump's presidency. And there is a direct correlation between his comments, his hate and xenophobia, and his targeting of Black and Brown communities, and the policies that he rolls out, as well as the ways in which the judicial system seems to keep upholding his very ludicrous and unconstitutional claims. And so we've seen that with the Ramos decision. They somehow cannot agree that, his comments like Haiti is a, I don't know if I can even say this, but a shithole country, just the really awful things that he's been saying about Black and Brown communities and nationals from countries like Haiti and Somalia, which are TPS countries. And so there's a direct correlation, obviously, between those comments and the removal of some of these countries from being able to have things like TPS. And so that's something that's a recent update, and some of the work that our organizations have been really trying to work around, trying to provide relief for our members who, are understandably confused what this all means, for their status and their livelihood during a pandemic. How do you have deportations during such a difficult and complicated and dangerous time? And the reality is this country has continued to have forced deportations during this time. There have been over 4 or 5 chartered planes to Haiti during the pandemic, full of Haitian nationals, and many of which have had COVID. And so this is really, not only is it, white supremacy in the policies and the systems, it is really rooted in anti-Blackness. And in addition to that, it's a public health crisis, because you are, harming, folks who have contracted the virus, and you are now literally spreading it globally and just not even taking into account human rights, and the dignity of people in this really challenging moment. And so these are some of the things that are happening in the backdrop of, you know, social uprising, a global pandemic, rollbacks in terms of immigration and immigrant rights, and really egregious human rights violations in detention centers and prisons around the country. Complete disregard to safety precautions in these detention centers and prisons in relation to COVID, and just a number of things. And it's really a very difficult time to navigate for members, you know, to try and articulate, and when I say members, some of the members that our organizations are working with, you know, what it means to have to plan a year in advance and really not know where your life will be in 6 months. And so that's kind of the challenges that, you know, a lot of our organizations have been trying to navigate. And all of this is rooted in anti-Blackness and an immigration and justice system that is not designed in the benefit of Black and brown people, but designed in upholding white supremacy. And it's doing a really good job. And so it's our job as advocates and organizers and those on the front lines to really challenge these systems and make it so that there is some level of accountability. As you mentioned, Becky, just yesterday, you know, we're hearing about Breonna Taylor and the decision with no accountability at all. And, you know, it's difficult to envision a world where the state can hold itself accountable. We rarely see it, but we still push forward in trying to find some forms of transformation and restorative practices. And so that's just some of the things that are happening in the communities that we work with. And as you mentioned again, Iman, a large number of the organizations serve Black immigrant members and communities, which are disproportionately impacted in the immigration space, as well as every space in this country. To refer back to, Becky, your point that this country was, you know, built on slavery and genocide. So that's some of the work that we're doing, and, you know, hopefully in this conversation we can really get to some of the root causes and talk through some of those solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really, really important. And to hear about what's happening to the impacted communities, how there's fear and there's so much planning about trying to plan for the potential future without knowing what it is. It's just, it's maddening and heartbreaking, but it's really, really inspiring also to hear that there's people like you at least there to try to provide some guidance and some support. So thank you for all your work. I did want to just, I just wanted to let people know that they should definitely feel free to ask questions in the question and answer box. I'll use my moderator's prerogative or privilege and ask, I did want to ask Asha a specific question, because you are working in a coalition, and Becky and I have really been kind of obsessed with this idea of how do we not let white supremacy divide, say, advocates who are working to, you know, fight against racism and white supremacy in the criminal legal system, and also advocates who are fighting, you know, unjust immigration policy, right? So how do we, and you sort of straddle those two worlds, right? That's your bread and butter. And you also work with Muslim communities, and you also work with African communities who aren't necessarily Muslim, right? So you're really intersecting in all kinds of ways. And I just find it, like, I know we work in coalition, and it's been I think a really exciting challenge that we've sort of tried our best to sort of explore how we can maybe help or learn or listen to ways that we can, you know, help bridge those gaps. And I just want to hear if you have any insights or any kind of advice for us, because it's really interesting and it's so important, right? Because white supremacy, like you said, does a really good job of dividing people who are both being, you know, oppressed by white supremacy.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you say that I navigate that space well. I mean, I try, I do my best. It's not easy. And I think working in a coalition for me in the moment that, each organization does a bit of that work. And so that kind of sort of facilitates that space. However, I do see that, there's a schism between, the immigration advocacy space and then the like criminalization space, when really, as you'd mentioned, and the work that a lot of us are trying to do is to show the parallels on the ways in which both systems are dependent upon each other, and that they intersect and that they impact communities in a compounded way. And so I think it's really the first step I would always say is, just trying to draw those parallels for people and trying to explain things in a way that's relatable. For example, this morning I was on in a conversation with Black Agenda Report, and one of the things that the interviewer had mentioned was how a lot of Americans can't really build meaningful solidarity with other countries and other liberation movements abroad, but can somehow completely understand what's happening here, but not relate it to sort of American exploitation of imperialism and wars and so on and so forth. And, I tried to tell him, well, if you don't see something, it's really difficult to make those parallels. Like, someone literally has to say the same military that, you're saying like, yay, support our troops, are this like very similar and, interconnected to the police that you're saying is committing police brutality here. So, to try and like show that there are parallels between systems and the way they operate, I think that is able to really build those meaningful coalitions. A few years ago, we actually hosted through Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, Black Crimigation and Criminalization like conference and working group in Detroit. It was the first of its kind that, brought immigrant folks who worked within the immigrant advocacy space, and then also the criminalization space, and then those who did a bit of both, who are Black immigrants. And so it was a number of organizations and folks specifically working on the intersection of both of these areas, and really drawing parallels and also strategies around addressing detention, the carceral state as a whole, policing and surveillance, because it intersects across both. And it disproportionately impacts Black communities, and particular Black Muslim communities, when we think about, countering violent extremism program, TVTP, as well as other forms of surveillance, when we think about activists, how they're being surveilled. So I think really just trying to show that, these mechanisms of surveillance, policing, facial recognition, they're used as forms of control for Black and Brown communities, and they exist in both bubbles. That's just kind of how I go about that.
Was perfect. That was so perfectly put. I can't even, you just have to, I just love how you just gave us that whole thread, and you just wove it perfectly together. I haven't heard that ever, connecting surveillance and, the carceral state and all of that. That was perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a really important, challenge. And I think the best way is to connect those, right? And that's kind of what your coalition does. You guys work on both issues. You show up in both spaces. And I think that's the best way to connect them, is by sort of explaining to people that, yeah, like detention is similar to being, incarcerated, and vice versa. All right, wonderful. I wanted to turn, looks like we have a question. We have Cynthia, who has a question for us. Thank you for the question. She has a question about, she's from the Matthew Shepard Foundation. Thank you for joining. She was asking, is there a pathway to engaging in constructive conversations with folks that disagree with us? Should we even try? That's a good question. who wants to take that one? I think that's a really important one, actually, because there are people who disagree with us, and we have to talk to them, maybe, or maybe not. Mm-hmm.
I will say, first of all, thank you, Cynthia. It is good to hear from you. I've had the opportunity to work with Cynthia both when she was at the Matthew Shepard Foundation, but also before when she was at Civil Rights Unit at the FBI. And I think that the question she asked is one that I would imagine Asha, because of her training in terms of dispute resolution, thinks a lot about. Something I come back to, and this is something, the Community Relations Service, part of the mandate there was to, I'm just going to do a quick plug for the Community Relations Service in response to this, because I think I want people to know more about that agency. It is a small but mighty component of the Department of Justice, but it was created as a part of the Civil Rights Act of '64, and it was created as this sort of idea that communities should be at the table in determining what public safety looks like and what public safety means for them, and they should be at the table making decisions around what their safety looks like. And in terms of sort of, one of the things it talked about is sort of addressing tension associated with racism and discrimination, later expanded to address, to help prevent and respond more effectively to hate crimes on the basis of race, as well as gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and disability. But at the core was this recognition that we cannot go anywhere without communities being at the center of making those determinations. And so actually, as we talk about system reform, system change, it is one of the things we hear a lot about is that we need to really reimagine whether it's public safety or what our communities look like, and communities should be at the center of that. But at the Community Relations Service, one of the things we talked about is when you come into a community, who should be at the table? One of the things we talk about a lot is that often people will come into communities and say, yes, I want to make this an inclusive process to make sure I'm getting policy ideas. And then they will go to sort of the same heads of the major organizations, the major civil rights groups, and not reach people who maybe are not affiliated with those groups because they don't trust those groups either, because they have. And so I think one of the things we talk about is you have to reach out and make sure you're reaching people beyond those traditional groups. But the other thing I think, and I'm going to cite Robert Jones Jr., who tweets as Son of Baldwin, so folks may have read him. But one of the things he talks about, and I often, when I talk to, I have Iman outed me because of my connection with Ohio State. Last year, I was working with Ohio State's law school, and one of the things we talked about there in the context of dispute resolution is really thinking about what does that look like? Who do you bring to the table? One of the things that Robert Jones Jr. has talked about is we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and the denial of my humanity and the right to exist. So I think one of the things we talk about is, yes, we should bring people, and I think to answer Cynthia's question, yes, there can be constructive conversations, but we should not be asking people to have a constructive dialogue with someone who will deny the very humanity of another person. And so I think that is sort of something that we should establish. I also think that someone who has, as someone who is white and has privilege to go into those conversations, I should be the one, because there is a lot of risk and threat to people who are targeted, whose humanity is denied. So I think that another response to that question would be that someone, yes, I have an obligation to make sure that I am working with communities who may, disagree initially. But I think at the end of the day, what we are talking about is we need a fierce and honest reckoning with our history. So as Asha pointed out, we cannot pretend that that our country was not formed and often relied on slavery, and that we are continuing to see the impact of that. But I also think, because of my little, actually, see, I can't even point the right side. What's next to me, Building an America as Good as Ideals. I mean, part of the reason I decided to go work for the government, part of the reason that I think, I believe that is that we do have these ideals. We have these ideals that honestly Black Americans have fought for and died for since before our country was founded. And so out of sort of respect for that work, I do think we, and I have an obligation to try and come to the table with people and identify what some of those common ideals are and figure out how we can kind of work together towards those. So I think it's it's an important question with a complicated response. And I do come back to the quote that I just cited from Robert Jones Jr., which is yes, but I was working with a mayor last year who had a white nationalist in their city who was very active and very and talking a lot about sort of what she believed was and basically propagating racist ideology. And people said, well, do we need to bring the Proud Boys to the table? And I said, no. You know, there is sort of, we do need to sort of think about how we are grounded in some kind of common sense of humanity. That said, we can have that grounding and people can be open to learning the truth, but we always come back to the truth. And that's why our organization just last week, in response to President Trump's latest sort of threat that he was going to, create some kind of new coalition and basically try and, end history as we know it. No, we kind of said nobody should be forced to think like Donald Trump, and no one should be, and no one should pretend like we don't know what our history is. That's why I think the 1619 Project is so critical, and the work that the groundbreaking work there is something that it really should be across the country. We should be all kind of grounded in that truth. And so I think grounded in truth, we can go forth and engage with people who may disagree. But I think we also need to think about who we're asking to go do that work and recognize the risks that people put themselves in when they go do that work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Becky. Yeah, that was a really, I think it is a really nuanced, and I think helpful answer, because it's, it's easy to just say, yeah, like bring everyone to the table and just have a discussion. But when we bring certain people to the table, we make other people feel less safe, and then other people are not going to come to the table, right? And so, like you said, if one party is like the Proud Boys, who are a white nationalist militia, are going to make other people feel uncomfortable, maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe you can meet with them separately, but not in coalition with everyone else. But yeah, I would love to hear from Marita. Your organization is so effective and important, working at the front lines with communities. How do you all combat, model minority stereotyping? I know Asian Americans are always put in this category where they just kind of take it and they don't really, they don't complain too much and they make it so and that's a way of undermining, liberation for other groups, right? Black folks and others. And so this goes back to this tension within spaces where you have white supremacy pitting one group against another. And that's a kind of a way of doing this does that. And I was just wondering like how you all work on that and how you combat that, because you guys are so good at it.
Well, thank you for the compliment. No, I think, one of the first things is to name it for what it is, right? It's a model minority myth, right? Which, some people unfortunately embrace it because it sort of casts our community as a good one, but that's why it's so insidious, right? Because it's a false narrative that really seeks to pit Asian Americans against other communities of color, right? The whole idea was brought up to sort of point to Asian Americans, be like, look, they're doing fine. Why can't other communities do that? So it's insidious, it's harmful, it's wrong. So anytime we name model minority, we make sure we say myth also, right? And try to unpack that for folks. I think Becky gave a great answer to the last question, but that, another response is something that we continue to deal with is educating our own communities about our history. We continue to be a predominantly immigrant community. And so there will always be people who are new to this country and are not familiar with our history, are not familiar with the civil rights movement. So that is something we need to continually do, is to educate our own community about what's come before, all the sacrifices that were made to get us the rights that we have and the privileges that we enjoy, right? But also, help people to understand that we are always still seen as foreign and not fully American, and that the answer to that isn't to sort of say, but we're not X group, right? That's not the answer. It's to, find commonality with others and try to be in the same fights together and hopefully not undermine, the causes and things that our allies are fighting for. So there's so much more I could say, but hopefully that's
a really important point. No, I really appreciate that point, because I worked a lot with immigrant communities, and Asha, I'm sure, can speak to this, especially, within, or at least in my experience, right? And a lot of folks with surveillance, for example, they're like, well, what's wrong? I have nothing to hide. And I'm like, no, in America, civic engagement means asserting your rights, And if you don't assert your rights, you lose them, you forfeit them. And so I know you all do a lot of know your rights trainings, and Asha, does a lot of those as well. And Becky obviously knows about those, because communities, again, like feel like, well, we're coming from authoritarian nations where you don't say no to the police. But here, if you don't assert your rights, then you're actually taken advantage of, and then you're taken into this, you're going to be pulled into a mess. So that's a really important point. I think just civic engagement generally is important with all communities, but particularly with immigrant communities who are targeted. I did want to, I wonder if there's any other questions, but I was wondering, one other question I was going to ask was, how do we prepare for, discussions that people flag that relate to, this idea that, this is an exception, right? This moment is different, right? It's exceptional. And so white supremacy is not really systemic, right? It's not. That's what people tell me. Like, people say this all the time, right? And we hear this, right? We always hear this from, from a lot of people who are moderate, who are seemingly moderate, right? And they say, well, this is different. Like, Trump is different. We're not going to vote for Trump. That's kind of their answer. And I wonder, if there is a new administration, and again, I'm not saying that people should vote for one or the other, but I'm saying, if there is a new administration, does that mean that white supremacy goes away? I think that that's always a question that, and I think that there are quite a few people that say that. They say, well, for example, like, no, we're not racist. Look, the same people voted for Trump who voted for Obama, right? You guys, I'm sure, have heard this. So I'm just always curious, like, how we respond to these questions. Asha, anything? You don't have to answer.
I would say that, honestly, if people are saying, okay, well, the same people voted for Trump and voted for Obama, I mean, honestly, it's 2020. Like, a lot of things are very bizarre and very strange. Doesn't mean that, with the new administration, that, of course, there's going to be some changes, right? I'm not trying to say that Donald Trump is like other presidents, because he is truly, he's truly a remarkable case. I would say that he's definitely more vocal in a lot of ways that previous presidents have not been, and so I think that's the biggest difference. There is, of course, some level of animus that is with his policies and statements. But the biggest difference is really that he's just more vocal, because, during President Obama, there was a record number of deportations and detention. You know what I'm saying? And everyone thought, okay, we have a Black president. It's a post-racial society. We've arrived at the Mecca, we're healed, glory be to God. And really, there wasn't too much of a difference if we're looking at the ways in which the state functioned, and the fact that 7 countries abroad that are Muslim majority countries were being droned throughout the entirety of Obama's both terms. So, and this is not to say that, it doesn't really make a difference, because of course, to some extent, there is the room for some change and transformation. But I would say, no, racism and white supremacy and policies that directly target our communities will not end with a new administration. Can they get a little bit less nefarious and less intentional? Possibly. There's a high likelihood in that. And so I think it would be irresponsible to say there's no difference at all, because there absolutely would be. But to say that this would all end is also not true.
It's like naive, right? Yeah, that's a perfect answer. It's like, Black Lives Matter was born under Obama. People forget that. Like, the movement was born, that movement was born then because there were a lot of police shootings as well. And President Trump passed the First Step Act, which tries to decarcerate, did more things for Black people, and he's trying to take credit for that. But it's funny, because I always hear this, and I'm always just kind of like, I guess it just kind of shows the complexity and how complicated white supremacy really is.
And how horrible, I'm sorry to cut you off, Iman,
Yeah,
and
no.
how just horrible our education system is intentionally. The K through 12 education system has no room for popular education, no room for real civil, you know, an understanding of the way society functions, or the way government functions, the history of this nation, what it takes to actually make amendments, laws, put policies into play, as well as what happens when you have a policy, and then how do you make it into a real accommodation? How do these things look in real terms? And so I think none of that is really embedded in the American education system. And then on top of that, there's also the disparity in the quality of education that you can have based off of your income and where you live and property tax. So that in and of itself is furthering that disparity and inability to really better understand what we're up against. And again, that's by design. So sometimes I'm like, wow, how could you think that? And then other times I'm like, I could see why someone who maybe just hasn't fully had the ability to understand these systems and been taught critical, you know, like critical thought process, wouldn't really understand how some things are meant to stay exactly the same by design, you know? So I think really we have to also go back to the way the education system is designed in this country.
Absolutely. No, that's an excellent point. I think it really does start with education. So we have maybe 2 minutes left. So I just want to give each of you maybe 30 seconds to give final thoughts, and we're going to cut off. So Marita, you want to give your final, or Becky, your final?
Oh, no, sorry. I was talking to someone.
No, go ahead, Marita. 30 seconds, just closing, you know.
Yeah, no, I saw one of the questions was like, please give us some parting hopeful thoughts, which I completely understand the sentiment. It's rather a tall order, right now.
Yeah, it is.
So I will just say that I take heart from the fact that a lot of these, there is a growing realization about systemic racism, right? And more people are turning inward and asking the questions and grappling with this, and at least the conversations are starting to happen. So we need to find more ways to encourage more of these conversations to happen and to channel them in productive ways. So I will say that.
So much. That's excellent. That's right. I think that's right. It looks like the Black Lives Matter movement. We see people from all across the spectrum. It's no longer radical to be for Black Lives Matter. So that's a great point. Go ahead, Becky.
I would just sorry, I'm having two conversations here. Look, I think that there is a reason for hope. I think that we cannot afford to despair. And the reason I think is if you look at the people who are risking everything in the streets, people who previously maybe had the privilege to not acknowledge the way that white supremacy was affecting us, no longer can ignore it. I mean, I shouldn't say that, they can, but it is much more difficult. And I think the reason we're having these conversations now is that people believe that we can make a country, we can make America better, coming closer to its ideals. To Asha's point, there is no question that it's not going to magically happen depending on who's in the White House. But if we have, that it absolutely does matter who's there, because we can kind of work together in a more sort of effective and sort of dedicated way. We're asking the right questions, and we can work together to come to a more just sort of a just country that will keep, but we'll have to keep working, and it will democracy, as Congressman Lewis said, it's a verb.
That's right. Democracy is a verb. Asha, you get the last word.
I'm going to try and be positive as well. Thank you guys all for this wonderful conversation. I would say that every major change in this nation has been led by the people, for the people, and anything moving forward that will be successful will not be through systemic or institutional leadership, but it will be on the front lines, on the ground, from the people who are most impacted, those who are in detention centers, those who are currently in prison. This is where the movement for liberation will be born from, and I'm excited to see where that goes.
Thank you so much, all of you, for all of your work at the front lines, for all of your work inside, outside government, and civil society. And it's my honor to sit here and to preside over this wonderful conversation. And I'll see you guys out there fighting for a better America. Take care.
Thank you. Bye all. Thank you all.
Bye.